The thunder rolled across the prairie like a freight train, and Sarah Mackenzie pressed her face against the cold window of the general store. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the bright afternoon sky into an angry canvas of black and gray clouds. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the rain begin to fall in thick. Heavy drops that splattered against the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge. Sarah had been in town picking up supplies for her father's ranch when the weather turned. Now she was trapped, waiting for the storm to pass before she could make the long ride home. The other townspeople had scattered to their homes and businesses, leaving the streets eerily quiet except for the sound of rain drumming against the wooden buildings. She was about to turn away from the window when she saw him. A lone rider appeared through the curtain of rain, his horse moving slowly down the empty street. Even through the storm, Sarah could see that he was a stranger. Cedar Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and she had never seen this man before. The rider was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long black coat that was already soaked through. His hat was pulled low over his face, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that seemed unbothered by the storm, stepping carefully through the mud and puddles as Sarah watched. The stranger pulled up in front of the saloon across the street. He sat on his horse for a moment, looking up and down the empty street as if he was searching for something or someone. Then he dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of years of practice. He tied his horse to the hitching post and walked toward the saloon doors, his spurs ringing against the wooden boardwalk. Sarah found herself holding her breath as he paused at the entrance to the saloon. For just a moment, he turned and looked directly at the general store window where she stood. Even from across the street and through the rain, she felt the intensity of his gaze. It was as if he could see right through the glass and into her soul. Her heart began to beat faster. She felt a strange flutter in her stomach that she had never experienced before. Then he pushed through the saloon doors and disappeared inside, leaving Sarah staring at the empty street. She touched her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beating of her heart. Who was he? What was he doing in Cedar Ridge? And why did the sight of him make her feel so unsettled and yet so alive at the same time? The storm continued to rage outside, but Sarah barely noticed it now. Her mind was filled with questions about the mysterious stranger. She had lived in Cedar Ridge her entire 22 years, and nothing this exciting had ever happened before. The town was peaceful and predictable, filled with the same faces she had known since childhood. Her life followed the same routine day after day, helping her father run the ranch, attending church on Sundays, and socializing with the same small group of friends and neighbors. But there had been something different about this man. Something that set him apart from the cowboys and ranchers she knew. He had an air of danger about him, a sense that he had seen things and done things that would shock the good people of Cedar Ridge. Yet there was also something compelling about him, something that drew her attention like a moth to a flame. Sarah tried to shake off these strange feelings and focus on more practical matters. The storm was beginning to ease up a bit, and she should be thinking about getting home before dark. Her father would be worried if she was late. She still had a long ride ahead of her through muddy roads and treacherous terrain. But even as she gathered her packages and prepared to leave the store, she found her eyes drifting back to the saloon across the street. She wondered what the stranger was doing in there, whether he was planning to stay in town for long, and what had brought him to Cedar Ridge in the first place. The town rarely saw visitors, especially not the kind of man who rode alone through. Stormson carried himself with such quiet confidence as Sarah stepped out onto the covered porch of the general store. She heard the sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. It was a melancholy tune that seemed to match the mood of the stormy afternoon. She paused for a moment, listening to the music and thinking about the man who had disappeared behind those swinging doors. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Sarah knew she needed to start for home soon. But something kept her rooted to the spot, some instinct telling her that this afternoon would be important somehow, that the arrival of this stranger would change things in ways she could not yet imagine. She untied her horse from the hitching post in front of the store and swung up into the saddle. As she guided her mare out onto the muddy street, she took one last look at the saloon. The music had stopped now. The building looked dark and quiet in the gray afternoon light. But Sarah had the strangest feeling that this was not the last she would see of the mysterious rider. Something told her that their paths would cross again, and when they did, her life would never be the same. As she rode out of town toward her family's ranch, the image of the stranger stayed with her, burned into her memory like a brand on cattle hide. 3 days passed before Sarah saw the stranger again. She had tried to put him out of her mind, telling herself that he was probably just passing through town and would be long gone by now. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, looking at her through the rain, and every time she went to town, she found herself glancing toward the saloon. On Thursday morning, Sarah rode into Cedar Ridge to pick up medicine for one of their ranch hands who had taken ill with fever. The sky was clear and blue, a sharp contrast to the stormy afternoon when she had first seen the mysterious rider. The main street was busy with the usual activity of market day, with wagons and horses lined up outside the various shops and businesses Sarah had just finished her business at the doctor's office when she heard raised voices coming from the direction of the bank. She hurried toward the commotion, along with several other curious townspeople. What she saw there made her blood run cold. 3 rough-looking men had surrounded old Mr. Peterson, the bank manager, outside his establishment. They were clearly not from Cedar Ridge, with their worn leather clothes and the hard look of men who lived outside the law. One of them, a tall man with a scraggly beard and cruel eyes, had his hand resting on the gun at his hip in a threatening manner. "We know. You got money in there, old man?" the bearded stranger was saying, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "And we know you got information about certain people who might have accounts with your bank. You're going to give us what we want, or things are going to get real unpleasant for you and this whole town." Mr. Peterson was trembling, but he stood his ground. "I cannot and will not give you access to private bank records or funds that do not belong to you. Now, please leave my establishment before I call the sheriff." The bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Out of town, remember? Gone to the capital for some fancy meeting. Won't be back for days. That means there ain't nobody here to stop us from taking what we want." Sarah felt a chill of fear run through her. It was true that Sheriff Morrison had left town 2 days ago on official business. The deputy was a young man named Tommy, who meant well, but had never faced anything more serious than a Saturday night drunk. These men looked dangerous, the kind who would not hesitate to use violence to get what they wanted. The crowd of townspeople, who had gathered to watch the confrontation, began to back away nervously. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that was growing in her own heart. Cedar Ridge was a peaceful community that rarely saw trouble of this kind. Most of the men were farmers and storekeepers, not gunfighters. Just as the bearded stranger reached for his weapon, a calm voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Seems to me you boys are causing some trouble for these good people." Sarah turned toward the voice and felt her heart skip a beat. The mysterious rider from the storm. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his thumbs hooked casually in his gun belt, but there was nothing casual about the way his eyes assessed the situation. He looked relaxed and confident, as if facing down 3 dangerous men was something he did every day. The bearded stranger spun around to face this new threat. "This ain't none of your business, mister. You best move along before you get hurt." The stranger stepped forward, and Sarah noticed that the crowd parted to let him through. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, an aura of quiet authority that made even the townspeople look at him with a mixture of fear and admiration.
Out.
"Well, I reckon it became my business when you started threatening innocent folks," he said, his voice still calm, but with an underlying steel that made it clear he meant business. "Now why don't you boys climb back on your horses and ride out of town before someone gets hurt?" The second outlaw, a shorter man with a scar across his cheek, spat into the dirt. "You think you can take all 3 of us, stranger?" said Mysterious. Ryder smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "I faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. Question is, are you boys feeling lucky today?" Sarah found herself holding her breath as the tension in the street became almost unbearable. She could see that the stranger's hand was resting lightly near his gun, ready to draw at a moment's notice. The 3 outlaws were spreading out slightly, trying to get better positions for a fight. Then something unexpected happened. The bearded leader looked more closely at the stranger, and his eyes widened with recognition. "Wait a minute," he said. Slowly, "I know you. You're Jake Morrison, the one they call the Ghost Rider. I heard you was dead." "Well, you heard wrong," Jake Morrison replied evenly. "And now that you know who you're dealing with, I suggest you make the smart choice and ride out." The change in the outlaws was immediate and dramatic. Sarah could see the fear creeping into their eyes as they realized who they were facing. Even she had heard stories about the Ghost Rider, though she had always assumed they were just legends. He was said to be the fastest gun in the territory, a man who had cleaned up some of the most lawless towns in the West. The bearded leader was clearly torn.
Ow.
Between his desire for the money in the bank and his instinct for self-preservation, finally, survival won out. "This ain't over," he growled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "We'll be back." "I'll be waiting," Jake said simply. The three outlaws mounted their horses and rode out of town at a gallop, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. The crowd of townspeople began to cheer and applaud, but Jake Morrison had already turned and was walking away. As if facing down three dangerous men was just another ordinary day for him, Sarah watched him go, her mind reeling with this new information. Jake Morrison, the Ghost Rider. The stories about him were legendary throughout the territory. Tales of a mysterious gunfighter who appeared out of nowhere to help those in need, then disappeared just as quickly. She had never imagined that such a man would come to their quiet little town. As Jake walked past her, their eyes met for just a moment. Sarah felt that same electric jolt she had experienced during the storm, a connection that seemed to spark between them like lightning. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture and continued on his way, leaving Sarah standing in the street with her heart pounding and her mind full of questions she was afraid to ask. That evening, Sarah could not stop thinking about what had happened in town. She sat on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the prairie. But her mind kept returning to Jake Morrison and the way he had faced down those three outlaws without breaking a sweat. Her father, Robert Mackenzie, had been full of praise for the mysterious stranger when she told him about the incident. "Jake Morrison, you say?" Her father had mused, stroking his graying beard.
"I heard
"That name before, back in my younger days? They say he's the kind of man who can't abide injustice, goes around helping folks who can't help themselves. But I also heard he's got troubles of his own, running from something in his past." Now, as darkness began to fall across the ranch, Sarah found herself wondering what kind of troubles could drive a man like Jake Morrison to live the life of a wandering gunfighter. What secrets was he carrying? And why did the thought of his troubles make her heart ache with sympathy for a man she barely knew? Her quiet contemplation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. Sarah stood up, peering into the growing darkness. A single rider was coming up the long dirt road that led to their ranch, and even in the dim light, she recognized the silhouette of the man who had been occupying her thoughts all day. Jake Morrison rode into the circle of light cast by the lanterns hanging from the porch, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Up close, without the rain and chaos of the confrontation in town, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. His face was handsome but marked by lines that spoke of hardship and experiences beyond his years. "Evening, miss," Jake said, touching his hat politely. "I was wondering if I might have a word with your father. I heard in town that Robert Mackenzie runs an honest spread and treats his people fair." Before Sarah could answer, her father appeared in the doorway behind her. Robert Mackenzie was a big man, weathered by years of ranch work, but Sarah could see that he was impressed by their visitor's respectful manner. "You'd be Jake Morrison," her father said, stepping onto the porch. "My daughter told me what you did in town today. We're grateful to you for standing up to those troublemakers." Jake dismounted and approached the porch, moving with that same easy grace Sarah had noticed before. "Just did what any decent man would do, Mr. Mackenzie. Those boys were looking to hurt innocent people. I couldn't stand by and let that happen." "Well, we appreciate it all the same," Robert said warmly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison?" Jake looked slightly uncomfortable, as if asking for help did not come easily to him.
Truth is, I'm looking for work."
I know most folks around here probably wouldn't want to hire someone with my reputation, but I'm good with horses and cattle, and I can handle any trouble that might come around. Sarah saw her father's eyes light up with interest. The ranch had been short-handed since two of their regular cowboys had left to try their luck in the gold fields up north. And after what had happened in town, the idea of having a man like Jake Morrison around for protection was clearly appealing. As it happens, we could use another hand, Robert said thoughtfully. But I'll be straight with you, Morrison. Got a daughter to think about, and I need to know that any man working for me is trustworthy and decent. Jake's eyes flicked to Sarah for just a moment before returning to her father. I give you my word, Mr. Mackenzie. I've never harmed an innocent person in my life, and I never will. Your daughter would be as safe with me around as she would be in church. There was something in the way he said it, a sincerity that convinced Sarah, her father, was making the right decision even before Robert nodded his agreement. All right then, you got yourself a job. Pay is $30 a month plus room and board. You can bunk in the old cabin out by the north pasture. It ain't much, but it's clean and dry. That's more than fair, Jake said, and Sarah could hear the relief in his voice. I'll work hard for you, Mr. Mackenzie. You won't regret this. As her father and Jake worked out the details of his employment, Sarah found herself studying their new hired hand more closely. Despite his fearsome reputation, there was something gentle about him, a kindness in his eyes that contradicted the stories she had heard about the deadly Ghost Rider. She sensed that there were depths to Jake Morrison that few people ever saw, layers of complexity that made him far more than just a gunfighter. After Jake had ridden off to settle into his new quarters, Sarah helped her father secure the ranch for the night. As they walked through their evening routine of checking the animals and making sure everything was locked up tight, Robert talked about their new employee. I got a good feeling about that boy, he said as they headed back to the house. Got troubles, that's for sure. But he strikes me as fundamentally decent. And having him around might keep those outlaws from coming back to cause more problems. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were not on the practical benefits of Jake's presence. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her when he promised her father that she would be safe, the intensity in his blue eyes that had made her feel both protected and strangely vulnerable at the same time. That night, as she lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the prairie, Sarah found sleep elusive. She kept thinking about Jake Morrison in his lonely cabin, wondering what had driven him to this life of wandering and why fate had brought him to their ranch. She had lived a sheltered life in Cedar Ridge, never venturing far from home or experiencing anything more exciting than the occasional barn dance or church social. But now, with Jake's arrival, she felt as if her quiet, predictable world was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. There was something about him that called. To her, a mysterious pull that she did not fully understand, but could not ignore. For the first time in her 22 years, Sarah Mackenzie felt truly alive, as if she had been sleeping and was finally waking up to discover what life could really offer. As she finally drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was a question that would haunt her dreams. What secrets was Jake Morrison hiding, and what would happen when those secrets finally came to light? Over the next 2 weeks, Jake Morrison proved himself to be everything Robert Mackenzie could have hoped for in a ranch hand. He was up before dawn every morning, working alongside the other cowboys to tend the cattle and maintain the property. He was skilled with horses, gentle with the animals, and respectful to everyone on the ranch. The other workers, initially suspicious of the famous gunfighter, gradually began to accept him as one of their own. But it was Sarah who found herself most affected by Jake's presence. She caught herself looking for excuses to visit whatever part of the ranch he was working on, always under the pretense of bringing water to the workers or delivering messages from her father. Each encounter was brief and proper, but Sarah treasured every moment of conversation. Every smile, every polite tip of his hat when he saw her coming. Jake, for his part, seemed to be keeping a careful distance. He was always courteous and friendly, but Sarah sensed that he was deliberately maintaining barriers between them. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, a mixture of longing and something that might have been regret. It was as if he wanted to get closer to her, but was holding himself back for reasons she did not understand. One afternoon, Sarah was returning from town with supplies when she saw smoke rising from the direction of the old cabin where Jake lived. Her heart leaped with fear, and she spurred her horse into a gallop, terrified that something had happened to him. But as she drew closer, she realized the smoke was not from a fire, but from the chimney, and she could hear the sound of hammering coming from inside. She dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously, not wanting to intrude on Jake's privacy. But too curious to simply ride away, the door was standing open to let in the afternoon breeze. And she could see Jake inside, working on what appeared to be a piece of furniture. "Mr. Morrison?" she called out hesitantly. "Is everything all right?" I saw the smoke and was worried. Jake appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, tanned forearms, and there was a streak of sawdust in his dark hair. Sarah felt her heart flutter at the sight of him looking so domestic and approachable. "Just making some improvements to the place," he said with a slight smile. "Your father said I could fix it up however I wanted, and I've always been handy with tools." Sarah took a step closer, trying to peer past him into the cabin. "What are you making?" Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her see. The small cabin had been transformed from a bare, functional space into something that looked almost like a real home. He had built shelves along one wall and was working on a simple but well-crafted table. The floor had been scrubbed clean, and there were even curtains hanging at the windows. "It's wonderful," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "You've made it so comfortable. Where did you learn to do carpentry work?" A shadow passed across Jake's face, and Sarah immediately regretted the question. She had touched on something painful, some memory he preferred not to share. "My father taught me," he said quietly. "Back when I was young and thought I'd spend my whole life building things instead of ... He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Instead of what?" Sarah asked gently. Jake turned away from her, busying himself with organizing his tools. "Instead of the life I ended up living. Some roads, once you start down them, don't lead back to where you began." Sarah felt a surge of sympathy for the pain she could hear in his voice. "But you're here now," she said softly. "Working on the ranch, building furniture, living peacefully. Maybe this is your chance to find that different road." Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt the air between them become charged with electricity. For a moment, she thought he might tell her what he was running from, what had driven him to become the Ghost Rider. But then he seemed to remember himself and turned back to his work. "Your father's probably wondering where you are," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Should get back to the house." Sarah felt dismissed, but she was not ready to give up so easily. "Mr. Morrison, ... Jake. If you ever want to talk about whatever's troubling you, I'm a good listener." He was silent for so long that Sarah thought he was not going to answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "You're a good woman, Sarah Mackenzie. It's too good for the likes of me. You deserve someone who can give you a normal life, not someone who spent years running from his past." "What if I don't want a normal life?" Sarah surprised herself by saying, "What if I want something more than the same predictable routine day after day?" Jake's hands stilled on his tools, and when he finally looked at her, his blue eyes were intense with emotion. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what I've done, what I might have to do again someday. The kind of life I've lived leaves marks on a man, changes him in ways that can't be undone." "Then tell me," Sarah said, taking a step closer to him. "Help me understand." For a moment, Jake looked as if he might actually open up to her. His guard dropped, and Sarah saw the vulnerability beneath the tough exterior, the loneliness of a man who had been carrying his burdens alone for too long. But then the sound of approaching horses made them both turn toward the open door. 3 riders were coming up the path toward the cabin, and Sarah's blood ran cold when she recognized them. It was the same outlaws who had threatened the bank, the ones Jake had faced down in town. They had returned, and this time they looked angry and determined. Jake's transformation was instant and complete. Gone was the gentleman who had been showing her his carpentry work. In his place stood the Ghost Rider, calm and deadly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Sarah," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off the approaching riders, "I need you to get behind me and stay there, no matter what happens." The lead outlaw, the bearded man who had seemed to recognize Jake, called out as they drew near the cabin. "Well, well, if it ain't the famous Ghost Rider, playing house like a regular citizen. We got some business to discuss, Morrison." Da-da-da. Stepped out of the cabin, positioning himself between Sarah and the three men. "I thought I told you boys to stay away from Cedar Ridge." "You did," the outlaw replied with an ugly grin. "But we've been doing some asking around, and we learned some real interesting things about you, Morrison. Turns out there's people looking for you, people willing to pay good money to know where the Ghost Rider's been hiding." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the implications of what the man was saying. Jake's past had caught up with him, and now everyone on the ranch might be in danger because of it. She saw the tension in Jake's shoulders and knew that the peaceful life he'd been trying to build was about to come crashing down around him. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife as the three outlaws sat on their horses, studying Jake with predatory grins. Sarah pressed herself against the cabin wall behind Jake, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "What kind of business?" Jake asked, his voice steady, despite the danger they were all facing. The bearded leader leaned forward in his saddle, clearly enjoying having the upper hand for once. "The kind that involves Marshal Thompson from Colorado Territory. Seems he's been looking for you for quite some time, Morrison. Something about a bank robbery in Silver Creek 5 years ago. It's a real messy affair. A lot of good people got hurt." Sarah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. A bank robbery? Was Jake really a criminal, despite everything she had come to believe about his character? She saw his shoulders tense, but his voice remained calm when he replied. "Marshal, Thompson knows better than that. I never robbed any bank in Silver Creek or anywhere else." "Maybe not," the outlaw said with a shrug. "But the marshal's got witness says different. He's offering $500 for information leading to your capture. It's a lot of money for poor folks like us." The second outlaw, the one with the scar, spoke up. "Of course, we might be willing to forget what we know for the right price. Say whatever money the old man's got in that bank, plus maybe a little something extra from your boss here." Jake's hand moved slightly closer. "To his gun? And if I refuse? Then we ride into town and tell everyone exactly who's been working on the Mackenzie ranch. How long you think it'll be before a federal marshal shows up to drag you back to Colorado in chains?" Sarah watched Jake's face, trying to read his thoughts. She could see the conflict there, the knowledge that he was trapped between impossible choices. If he fought these men, people might get hurt. If he paid them off, they would just keep coming back for more. And if he ran, he would be giving up the first real home he had found in years. "I need time to think about it," Jake said finally. The bearded outlaw laughed. "You got until tomorrow night. We'll be waiting at the old mine shaft north of town. Come alone and bring the money, or we start talking to anyone who will listen." As the three men rode away, Sarah stepped out from behind Jake, her mind reeling with everything she had just heard. Jake stood watching them go, his face a mask of resignation that broke her heart. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "About the bank robbery?" Jake turned to look at her, and she could see the pain in his blue eyes. "Not the way they told it," he said, "but there's enough truth in their lies to cause trouble for everyone I care about." "Then tell me the real story," Sarah said, moving closer to him. "Please, Jake, I need to know." Jake was silent for a long moment, staring out at the prairie, where the outlaws had disappeared. Finally, he began to speak, his voice heavy with old grief. 5 years ago, I was working as a deputy marshal in Colorado Territory. I had a partner, a good man named Billy Carson. Got word that a gang was planning to rob the Silver Creek Bank, so we rode out to stop them. He paused, running a hand through his hair. We got there too late. The robbery was already in progress, and there were hostages inside. Billy wanted to wait for backup, but I could see through the window that they were getting ready to kill an old woman who had tried to protect her grandchildren. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as she listened to Jake's story. This was not the tale of a criminal, but of a man who had tried to do the right thing. "I went in alone," Jake continued. "Managed to get the hostages out, but in the confusion, Billy got shot. I killed 2 of the robbers and wounded a third, but their leader got away with the money. Billy died in my arms on the street outside that bank. But if you were a deputy marshal, why would anyone think you were involved? In the robbery? Jake's laugh was bitter. The leader of that gang was my brother, Thomas Morrison, wanted for robbery and murder in 3 territories. I'd been tracking him for months, hoping to bring him in before he got himself killed or hurt innocent people. When the townspeople saw the family resemblance and realized I'd let him escape, they started asking questions. Sarah felt her heart break for the pain in Jake's voice. Right. You let him go because he was your brother? I hesitated, Jake admitted. Just for a second, when I saw his face. That second cost Billy his life and let Thomas get away with the money. The marshal put me on leave pending investigation. But before they could clear me officially, witnesses started saying they'd seen me talking to Thomas before the robbery. Some even claimed I'd helped plan the whole thing. But that's not true.
Oh.
But it didn't matter. The damage was done. I resigned from the marshal service and became a drifter, trying to stay ahead of the rumors and the bounty hunters. That's how I became the ghostwriter, helping people in small towns where they didn't know my real story. Sarah reached out and touched Jake's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. And your brother? What happened to him? Jake's face hardened. I've been tracking him ever since, trying to bring him to justice for what he did to Billy and those innocent people. Every lead goes cold, every trail runs dry. Sometimes I think he's dead, but then I hear stories about robberies that sound like his work. They stood together in silence for several minutes, Sarah trying to process everything Jake had told her. She could see now why he had been so reluctant to get close to anyone, why he had tried to maintain distance between them. His past was a shadow that followed him everywhere, threatening anyone who got too close. What are you going to do about those men? Sarah asked finally. Don't know, Jake said honestly. If I pay them, they'll just keep coming back. If I fight them, someone might get hurt. And if I run, I'll be right back where I started, drifting from place to place with no home and no future. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at the defeated tone in his voice. There has to be another way. Maybe, Jake said, but he did not sound convinced. I need to talk to your father. Tell him the whole truth before those men come back. He deserves to know what kind of danger I've brought to his ranch. As Jake walked toward the main house, Sarah followed behind him, her heart breaking for the man she had come to care about so deeply. She could see that he was preparing to leave, to sacrifice his own happiness to protect her and her father from the consequences of his past. But Sarah Mackenzie was not the kind of woman to give up without a fight. Somewhere in her mind, a plan was beginning to form, a way to help Jake face his demons and finally find the peace he deserved. She just hoped she would have the courage to see it through when the time came. That evening, Sarah sat on the front porch listening to the low murmur of voices from inside the house where Jake was telling her father the whole truth about his past. She had wanted to stay and listen, but Jake had asked her to give them privacy, and she had reluctantly agreed. Now she waited anxiously, wondering how her father would react to learning that their trusted ranch hand was actually the infamous ghostwriter. The conversation inside seemed to go on forever. Sarah heard her father's voice rise occasionally, though she could not make out the words. Once she thought she heard Jake's chair scrape against the floor as if he had stood up abruptly.
Her imagination ran wild with possibilities. What her
Father fire Jake immediately? Would he demand that Jake leave the ranch tonight? Or worse, would he turn Jake over to the authorities? Finally, the front door opened and Jake emerged, followed by her father. In the lamplight spilling from the house, Sarah could see that both men looked serious, but not angry. Robert Mackenzie's face wore the thoughtful expression he got when he was working through a difficult problem. Sarah, her father said, Jake's told me everything. About his past, about those men who came today, about the trouble that might be heading our way. Sarah looked at Jake, trying to read his expression. And what did you decide? Robert Mackenzie settled into his favorite chair on the porch, gesturing for Jake to sit as well. I decided that I've been ranching for 30 years, and I've gotten pretty good at judging a man's character. Jake Morrison might have made some mistakes, but he's not a criminal. He's not running away from this fight. Sarah felt a surge of relief and admiration for her father. She had hoped he would see past the rumors and accusations to the good man she knew Jake to be, but she had not been completely certain. But those men, she said, they'll cause trouble for everyone if Jake stays. Jake leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. That's what I told your father. I think the best thing for everyone is if I move on, try to lead those men away from Cedar Ridge. I told him that's nonsense, Robert said firmly. Running away never solved anything. Those outlaws aren't going to give up just because you leave town. They'll find some other way to cause trouble, hurt innocent people. Besides, we've got a bigger problem than just those 3 troublemakers. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. What do you mean? Her father pulled out a letter from his shirt pocket. Got this from Sheriff Morrison when I was in town yesterday. Seems there's been a string of bank robberies across 3 territories, all with the same pattern. The sheriff thinks the gang is heading this way, and Cedar Ridge Bank would be a perfect target for them. Jake went very still. What kind of pattern? Well-planned hits on small-town banks, always during times when the local law enforcement is away or distracted. They seem to know exactly when to strike and how much money to expect. Someone's giving them inside information. Sarah saw Jake's jaw tighten. Sounds like Thomas. Your brother? Robert asked. Jake nodded grimly. That's his style. Always was good at finding people who could be bought or intimidated into helping him. If he's really heading this way, those 3 men who threatened us today might just be the advance scouts. The 3 of them sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation they were facing. It was no longer just about Jake's past catching up with him, but about protecting their entire community from a dangerous gang of outlaws. There's something else, Jake said quietly. If Thomas really is coming to Cedar Ridge, it's not just for the money. He knows I'm here. How could he know that? Sarah asked. Jake's expression was grim. Because I've been tracking him for 5 years, and he's been tracking me just as long. It's become a game to him, staying one step ahead of me while making. Sure, I know he's still out there, still hurting people. If he's planning to rob the Cedar Ridge Bank, it's because he wants to draw me into a confrontation. Robert Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, considering this new information. Finally, he spoke. Then we give him what he wants, but on our terms, not his. What do you mean? Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew what her father was thinking. I mean, we set a trap, Robert said. Use Jake as bait to draw Thomas and his gang into the open, somewhere we can control the situation. Jake shook his head immediately. I won't put you and Sarah in danger. This is my fight. Like hell it is, Robert said with surprising vehemence. This is about protecting our town, our neighbors, our way of life. You think I'm going to sit back and let a gang of outlaws terrorize the people I've known my whole life? Sarah felt a mixture of pride and fear at her father's words. She was proud of his courage and his loyalty to their community, but terrified of what might happen if they actually tried to face down Thomas Morrison and his gang. What about the sheriff? She asked. Won't he be back soon? Not for another week, Robert replied. And even if he was here, he's just one man with a young deputy. They wouldn't stand a chance against an organized gang. Jake stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out into the darkness. If we're going to do this, we'll need help. A few good men who know how to handle themselves in a fight. I can think of at least a dozen ranchers and businessmen in town who would stand with us, Robert said. Men who have families to protect and everything to lose if we let these outlaws take over. Sarah listened to the 2 men planning what sounded like a war, and her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had lived her entire life in the peaceful safety of Cedar Ridge, never imagining that she would someday be faced with such violence and danger. But as she looked at Jake saw the weight of responsibility and guilt he carried on his shoulders. She knew that she could not let him face this alone. Whatever happened in the coming days, she would stand by his side, just as her father was doing. There's one more thing we need to consider, Sarah said, surprising both men with the strength in her voice. Those 3 men who came here today, they're expecting Jake to meet them tomorrow night with money. If he doesn't show up, they'll know something's wrong and might warn Thomas. Jake turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the lamplight. You're right. I'll have to meet with them, try to buy us some time to organize our defenses. It's too dangerous, Sarah protested. They might try to take you prisoner, use you as leverage against Thomas. Maybe Jake agreed. But it's a risk we'll have to take. We need every advantage we can get if we're going to protect this town and finally put an end to Thomas Morrison's reign of terror." As the three of them continued to plan through the night, Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into an unknown future. Everything she had ever known about her safe, predictable life was about to change forever. The next day passed in a blur of activity as word spread quietly through Cedar Ridge about the danger facing their community. Robert Mackenzie rode from ranch to ranch, speaking with trusted neighbors and friends about the situation. By afternoon, more than 20 men had agreed to help defend the town against Thomas Morrison's gang. Sarah spent the day helping to prepare supplies and ammunition, but her mind was focused on the evening ahead when Jake would have to meet with the three outlaws. Despite all their planning, she could not shake the feeling that something would go wrong, that Jake was walking into a trap from which he might not return as the sun began to set. Jake prepared to ride out to the old mine shaft he had cleaned, and checked his guns, saddled his horse, and said goodbye to her father. Now he stood on the porch with Sarah, both of them trying to find words for what might be their final conversation. "I want you to promise me something," Jake said, taking her hands in his. "If things go badly tonight, if I don't come back, I want you to forget about me and live your life. Find a good man who can give you the happiness you deserve." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Don't talk like that. You're coming back." "Sarah," Jake said gently, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said days ago." She looked up at him, seeing the love and regret in his blue eyes. "What is it?" "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you standing in that store window during the storm. I know I have no right to say it, no, that I can't offer you the kind of life you deserve, but I needed you to know." Sarah's heart soared and broke at the same time. "Oh, Jake, I love you too. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you for weeks." Jake pulled her into his arms. Then, and they shared their first kiss, there on the porch as the sun set behind them. It was gentle and desperate at the same time, filled with all the love they felt for each other and all the fear of what the future might bring. When they finally separated, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I wish things could be different. I wish I could be the kind of man you deserve." "You are," Sarah whispered fiercely. "You're the bravest, most honorable man I've ever known. And when you come back tonight, we're going to find a way to build a life together, no matter what it takes." Jake smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him in days. "You make me want to believe that's possible, and believe it," Sarah said, "and come back to me." Jake mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering darkness, leaving Sarah standing on the porch with her heart full of love and fear. She watched until he disappeared from sight, then went inside to wait. With her father for word of what had happened at the mine shaft, the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Robert tried to distract them both with conversation about their plans for defending the town, but Sarah could see that he was just as worried about Jake as she was. Every sound from outside made them both jump, hoping it was the sound of Jake's horse returning. It was nearly midnight when they heard hoofbeats approaching the house. Sarah ran to the window and felt her knees go weak with relief when she saw Jake riding up to the porch. But her relief turned to concern when she saw that he was slumped in his saddle, clearly injured. Robert and Sarah both rushed outside to help him down from his horse. There was blood on his shirt and a gash on his forehead, but he was conscious and able to walk with their support. "What happened?" Robert asked, as they helped Jake into the house and settled him in a chair. "It was a trap," Jake said grimly as Sarah began cleaning the wound on his head. "They had 6 men waiting for me instead of 3. They wanted to take me alive, probably to hand over to Thomas when he arrives. But you got away," Sarah said, her hands trembling as she tended to his injuries. "Barely," Jake replied, "and I'm afraid I had to kill 2 of them in the process. The others will be riding hard to warn Thomas that his surprise is blown." Robert paced the room, his face grim. "How long do you think we have before they get here?" "Not long, maybe 2 days, 3 at the most." "Thomas won't want to give us time to organize or send for help." Jake winced as Sarah cleaned a deeper cut on his arm. "There's something else. I heard them talking before the shooting started. They're not just coming for the bank. Thomas has been planning this for months. Ever since he found out I was here, he wants to destroy everything I care about." Sarah felt a chill run through her at Jake's words. "What do you mean?" "He's going to burn the town," Jake said quietly. "Every building, every home. He wants to make sure I lose everything, just like I cost him that day in Silver Creek when I let Billy die trying to stop him." The room fell silent as the full implications of what Jake had said sank in. This was no longer just about stopping a bank robbery or settling old scores. Thomas Morrison was coming to Cedar Ridge with the intention of destroying their entire community out of spite for his brother. "Then we'll be ready for him," Robert said firmly. "We've got good men willing to fight, and we know he's coming. That gives us an advantage." Jake shook his head. "You don't understand? Thomas isn't just any outlaw. He's smart, ruthless, and he's got nothing left to lose. The men riding with him are killers who would burn down an orphanage for the right price. Then what do you suggest?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, despite the fear she felt. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire burning in the fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I think I should leave. Ride out of town and hope Thomas follows me instead of taking his anger out on innocent people." "No," Sarah said immediately. "Been through this already. Running away won't solve anything." "She's right," Robert agreed. "Besides, you said yourself that Thomas has been planning this for months. He's not going to change his mind, just because you're not here when he arrives." Jake looked at both of them, seeing the determination in their faces. Finally, he nodded. "Then we make our stand here. But I want everyone to understand what we're up against. Thomas Morrison is not going to show mercy to anyone, not even women and children. If we're going to fight him, some of us might not survive." Reached out and took Jake's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we'll face whatever comes together, all of us." As they began to plan their defense of Cedar Ridge, Sarah realized that the quiet, predictable life she had known was truly over. Tomorrow would bring a battle that would determine not only the fate of their town, but whether she and Jake would have any chance at the future they both dreamed of. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a spark of hope. They were no longer running from the past or hiding from the truth. They were going to face their demons head-on, and whatever happened, they would face it together. The morning sun had barely risen when the lookouts posted around Cedar Ridge spotted dust clouds on the horizon. Thomas Morrison and his gang were approaching, just as Jake had predicted. Throughout the town, men took their positions behind barricades, and in buildings, while women and children were moved to the most secure locations they could find, Sarah stood at the window of the general store, which had been chosen as the command post because of its central location and clear view of the main street. Her father was positioned across the street with several other ranchers, while Jake had taken a position in the church bell tower where he could see the entire town and coordinate their defense. As the dust clouds grew closer, Sarah could make out individual riders. There were at least 15 men, all heavily armed and riding with the confidence of those who had never met serious resistance. At their head rode a man who looked remarkably like Jake, though his face was harder and marked by cruelty where Jake's showed compassion. Thomas Morrison rode slowly down the main street, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty buildings. He knew this was a trap, but he seemed unconcerned by the prospect of facing the townspeople. To him, they were just sheep to be slaughtered. "Jake Morrison," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "I know you're here, brother. Come out and face me like a man, or I'll burn this whole town down around your ears." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jake appeared in the doorway of the church, walking slowly toward the center of the street.
"Ow."
Sarah held her breath, knowing that this confrontation had been building for 5 years and that everything they cared about hung in the balance. "Hello, Thomas," Jake said calmly. "You're looking well for a dead man." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Did you really think a little thing like a bullet could stop me?" "I've been looking forward to this reunion for a long time. And let's get it over with," Jake replied. "It's just you and me, the way it should have been 5 years ago. Leave these people out of it." "Oh, but that wouldn't be nearly enough," Thomas said, his smile turning cruel. "You cost me everything, Jake. My men, my reputation, my freedom. I've spent 5 years planning how to pay you back. It's going to involve watching everything you care about burn to the ground. As Thomas spoke, his men began to spread out along the street, taking positions that would allow them to set fire to multiple buildings simultaneously. Sarah realized with growing horror that Jake's brother was serious about destroying the entire town. "You want me?" Jake said, stepping further into the street. "Here I am. Let's settle this with guns. Winner takes all." Thomas considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, brother. I think I'll take my time with this. Boys, start with the schoolhouse. I want to watch Jake's face when he realizes he can't save everyone." Two of Thomas's men rode toward the school building, pulling torches from their saddlebags. But before they could reach their target, gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the town. The carefully planned ambush was finally sprung, and the quiet street exploded into chaos. Sarah watched in terror and fascination as the battle raged outside. The townspeople, led by her father and the other ranchers, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes and families. But Thomas's gang were experienced killers, and they gave as good as they got. Jake had drawn his guns and was moving through the street like a man possessed. His legendary speed and accuracy on full display. Sarah watched him take down 3 of Thomas's men in as many seconds, moving with a deadly grace that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. But Thomas was not standing idle. I had dismounted and was stalking his brother through the chaos of the battle, his own gun drawn and ready. Sarah could see that he was maneuvering to get a clear shot at Jake, who was focused on protecting the townspeople and might not see the threat until it was too late. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a rifle from the rack behind the counter and ran out into the street. She had learned to shoot as a child, helping her father hunt and protect their livestock from predators. But she had never fired a weapon in anger. Now, with Jake's life hanging in the balance, she found courage she never knew she possessed. "Jake," she shouted, raising the rifle toward Thomas. "Behind you!" Jake spun around just as Thomas fired, the bullet passing so close to his head that it knocked off his hat. In the same instant, Sarah pulled the trigger, her shot taking Thomas in the shoulder and spinning him around. It was not a fatal wound, but it was enough to give Jake the advantage he needed. The two brothers faced each other in the middle of the dusty street, their guns drawn and ready. Around them, the battle continued to rage, but for this moment, nothing existed except the final confrontation that had been inevitable since that day in Silver Creek 5 years ago. "You always were too soft, Jake," Thomas said, blood running down his arm from Sarah's bullet. "Caring about people, trying to do the right thing. Look where it got you." "It got me a life worth living," Jake replied, "something you never understood, and now you're going to die for it." Both men fired simultaneously, but Jake was faster by a fraction of a second. Thomas's bullet went wide, while Jake's found its mark. Thomas Morrison, the outlaw, who had terrorized 3 territories and caused so much pain and suffering, fell to his knees in the dirt and then toppled forward, with their leader dead. The fight went out of Thomas's remaining men quickly. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered, while others tried to flee and were captured by the townspeople who had positioned themselves around the edges of town. Within minutes, the battle was over and Cedar Ridge was safe. Jake holstered his guns and walked toward Sarah, his face a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and grief. She ran to meet him, throwing herself into his arms as tears of joy and sorrow streamed down her face. "It's over," Jake said, holding her tightly. "It's finally over." 6 months later, Sarah Mackenzie became Sarah Morrison in a wedding ceremony that brought together the entire community of Cedar Ridge. Jake had officially cleared his name with the authorities, his brother's death finally closing the book on the Silver Creek incident. Marshall Thompson himself had come to town to apologize for the years of suspicion and to offer Jake his old job back. But Jake had declined the offer. He had found something better than the life of a lawman or a drifter. He had found a home, a family, and a woman who loved him for who he truly was. Not the legend that had grown up around his name, as Sarah stood in her wedding dress, looking out at the rebuilt town that had become stronger and more united after surviving the attack. She thought about that stormy day when a mysterious stranger had first ridden into her life. She had been looking for adventure, for something more than the predictable routine of small-town life. She had gotten more adventure than she had bargained for. But she had also gotten something she had not even known she wanted. A love that was worth fighting for. A partner who would stand by her side no matter what challenges they faced. And the knowledge that sometimes the greatest adventures were the ones that led you home. Jake came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, and Sarah leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. The storm had passed. The stranger had become her husband. And the secret that had nearly destroyed them had ultimately set them free. Their new life together was just beginning, and Sarah had never been happier to face an uncertain future as long as Jake was by her side.